Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video of PJ Codes. Now in this video, we're going to be talking about the use of Scrum in agency environments versus product team environments. So we're going to analyze those things, and it's going to be a little different. It's going to be more of a vlog style. This is not going to be a tutorial, but let's see. So we're going to talk about things like what Scrum is, why it's used, what makes it effective, what are the different parts of Scrum, and then we're going to be analyzing the use of Scrum in an agency versus a product environment. So let's begin. But before we begin, remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with all your friends. Now, what is Scrum? Okay, so let's begin. Scrum is basically a framework of the Agile project management methodology, commonly that's used in the industry. Okay, so Scrum is basically a framework of Agile under which the design is where instead of just building this huge product and then just shipping it off to the client, what Scrum allows you to do is it allows you to build this product in increments, commonly known as sprints. Okay, so say you're building an app for a client, and you have a list of deliverables for the client, right? So you need to build the front end, you need to build the back end, all the logic, set up the servers and the databases, all that good stuff. All this stuff takes time, right? Initially, the way Scrum was designed to work is you work off of a backlog, right? And basically, the product owner, who's a part of the Scrum team, right? So the product owner is basically in charge of the backlog, and the backlog is just a list of to-dos for the app itself, for the project itself. And basically, right after the backlog is set up, which is usually the first step, it varies from team to team. Basically, what happens is the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the dev team. It's usually just the product owner and the dev team that usually take part in something called sprint planning, right? So sprint planning is basically when the product owner sits down with the dev team and discusses with the dev team, like, okay, how are we going to segregate? What do we want to deliver first? What do we want to put in our first sprint, right? And a sprint is just an increment of time. So it can be a 2-week sprint or a month-long sprint. It's commonly either or. It varies by organization. And basically, once you work in those sprints, so in your initial sprint planning, what happens is you plan out the items that are going to go from your backlog into your upcoming sprint. Once those items are set for that sprint, the sprint begins, and the dev team starts working on the sprint items, right? From the backlog, they start working on that sprint. And then what happens is once they're done, after say 2 weeks or even a month, whatever time frame was set for the sprint period, what happens is you have something called a sprint review. Okay, a sprint review is basically something. It's just a meeting that you sit down with the client. You call the client in, or well, today now it's going to be through Zoom or something. But you basically the product owner, the dev team, and the client sit down in the sprint review, and what happens is they go over the items that were the features that were built out during the sprint. And after the sprint review is complete, then the team does something called a sprint retrospect. So a sprint retrospect is exactly that. It's just a retrospect where the dev team primarily, they look back at the sprint and they figure out what lessons they needed to learn from the sprint. What went wrong, what they learned, what they could do different for the next sprint. And basically, after the sprint retrospect, the planning for the next sprint starts. So you have your next sprint planning, right? And then you take the items from the backlog, and this is all managed by the product owner. And the dev team, usually the senior developer and the product owner work together to allocate items and prioritize items from the backlog into the sprint, into the actual sprint planning. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what sprint is. It's just iterative delivery instead of building out an entire project or product and telling the client here's the product. But that's what makes Scrum so effective, is the constant feedback loop that is created, because now you're constantly improving, right? So think about the constant feedback after every sprint. Remember I said in every sprint review, you sit down with the client and the client and the dev team sit together and discuss the features that were built. Basically that sprint review is an opportunity for the feedback from the client, right? What did they like? What did they not like? What do they want to focus on the next sprint? Etc., etc. So in a nutshell, that's what Scrum is. Okay, so now what does a Scrum team consist of, right? So a Scrum team consists of three parts. You have your Scrum Master, you have your product owner, and you have your dev team, or usually it's called the development team, okay? So let's define these. So a Scrum Master is basically, think of the Scrum Master as a coach, right? A coach that guides the development team in using Scrum to their advantage, right? For using, he's one that facilitates Scrum practices within the dev team and coaches them and guides them on how to use these to self-organize and basically put themselves out of a job, right? The goal of the Scrum Master is to basically make the dev team as self-reliant as possible. Okay, now another role of a Scrum Master is to remove any kind of impediments that the dev team might be facing. So every morning, some companies do something called a daily stand-up, right? And so in a daily stand-up, it's basically just a roundabout. Everybody usually talks about three things. What am I working on today? What did I work on yesterday? And are there any impediments in my way from completing my job? And a Scrum Master's role is to basically work with the dev team and the other teammates to remove those impediments out of the dev team's way. Okay, so that's the Scrum Master. Now, the product owner is basically, think of the product owner as the one that's in charge of the project itself. So this could be the project manager or any other, title that, the company has set for that person who's in charge of the project itself. And these titles, don't get me wrong, like they're not set in stone for every company, right? So like a Scrum Master, could be labeled as something called a traffic manager in another company, right? And so these terms are interchangeable. A product owner could be a project manager, right? So it's basically the one who's in charge of the project is the product owner, and the one who is basically guiding the dev team and just working with them to coach them and easing their burden in self-organization and things like that. That's the Scrum Master. Okay, and then you have the dev team, of course, that consists of the people that actually write the software, that actually write the code, that do the work. And this consists of all the coders and also the design team as well. So the creative team, the UI UX team, these are all usually considered as part of the dev team itself. And it varies by company, but in a nutshell, this is what defines the dev team. And all of them, the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the dev team are part of the Scrum team. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Okay, so now what makes Scrum so effective, right? Let's talk about it a little bit. What makes Scrum so effective is the constant feedback loop that you're getting back from the client. Yes, you have allocated time, segregated time to perform your incremental tasks, right? And that's good. But what even makes those segregations of time effective, and hence making Scrum effective in a whole, is the constant feedback loop that allows the dev team to basically extract the client feedback, quickly implement it in the upcoming sprint, and then reviewing it with the client in the sprint review, and then constantly just cycling through those remaining changes and those remaining features. So that's really what makes Scrum so effective. And also another thing I should mention is that with Scrum, it's a very versatile framework. So there's no set in stone rules that you need to use, A to Z, in a specific company. With Scrum, you're allowed to basically extract the parts that work for your organization and use them as a part of your organization, right? So take the good parts, extract the bad parts, take it and apply it to your existing structure. And that's really what makes Scrum so effective. And yes, I mentioned the allocation of proper timing for all your different backlog items. Yes, definitely. But I think the two takeaways are the constant feedback loop and the versatility and flexibility of the Scrum framework as a whole. So now, what is an agency, right? So an agency is basically a company that basically caters to multiple clients, offering them a wide variety of services and products. So for example, an agency can provide the services of building websites for their clients, or some sort of graphic design or digital media, or some sort of digital ad services as well. So in a nutshell, that's what an agency is, where there are multiple clients, very, very tight deadlines, and typically inside agencies, the work is very unpredictable because it's coming in from all sides at all times, and it's very, very fast paced. Now, a product company is a company that sells a specific product or a specific service, and that's basically the stable product or service that they are selling to their clients. So for example, a software as a service company, which provides one particular service and not a wide variety of services, but one specific service for their company. Our product company could be, a company that sells a specific product. So, for example, even Apple, for example, could be classified as a product company because it's got a specific product, and yes, it does have some variants, and there'll always be variants in product companies. But in a nutshell, it sells a specific product, and it's that one stable set of products that generate the company revenue, and the company focuses on that one stable set of products. Okay. So now, since we've defined what an agency is and what a product team is, since we already know what Scrum is in a nutshell, let's analyze the implementations and the pros and cons of having Scrum in an agency environment versus a product environment. Okay, so let's begin. Now, in a product environment, it's much easier to implement Scrum because Scrum was initially designed to work for internal teams developing software, right? So Scrum was initially designed for a steady product flow, a steady product, and you have a basic workflow for the product, by which I mean a backlog of items, and basically the lifespan of that product is divvied up into sprints, right? And that's the beauty of Scrum, because that's, in a product company, that's where you get the most out of Scrum, because you're able to really take your time and groom the product backlog. The product owner does that, really. And you're basically allowed to really take your time and prioritize. And I shouldn't say take your time, but what I mean by taking your time is you're not under double-digit, deadline, tight deadlines like you are at an agency. At a product company, there's no typical retainer that you have to accomplish certain features in X amount of hours. In a product company, the CEO, the CTO, and the product owner typically work together to really define what the time frame, the iterations, the goals will really be, right? The timelines by which certain deliverables need to be met. And some companies, they're pretty flexible when it comes right down to it, but don't take my word for it. It varies by company, right? So what I mean is, in a product company, Scrum is a lot more. You can get a lot more out of using Scrum because your timelines are more expanded, and you can basically divvy them up into sprints, and you're working in those sprints, and you have retrospects and reviews, and you have time for constant client feedback and all that good stuff, right? In an agency, typically what happens is a sprint is usually the actual lifespan of the project. So like, say in a product company, your typical sprint is, say, 2 weeks. In an agency, you get 2 weeks, on an average to build out the entire product, because the agency is allotting you a certain amount of hours. They're paying for a certain amount of hours for all the work to be done. Okay, and you cannot go over those hours because the company is, the client is paying for those hours, right? So the more hours the development team takes, the more the client has to pay. So that's never a good thing. So that's why in an agency, it's very, you get a little less out of using Scrum. You can't use Scrum for all that it offers. All you can really do is you can prioritize the product backlog. You can groom the backlog, at the beginning of the project lifestyle. So say a new build comes in, a new project comes in, and the product owner or the project manager sits down with the dev team and says, hey, we have this new build that just came in, and we have 25 hours to get the whole thing done. And if you divvy that up by 6 to 8 hours a day, it usually equates to about 2 weeks, 5 days a week. It varies, right? So those hours need to be used very, very, very wisely. So the typical sprint, like the planning, is usually done. The account manager or the project manager is usually the one that sits down with the client, and the client explains exactly what they want. And then you have different teams that sit down in that meeting. Typically, it's the marketing team, the design team, and the dev team as well, because it's important for all those different teams. Like the marketing team, they need to figure out what's best for SEO, because the copy on the page, the paragraphs, the text on the page will determine their Google search rankings, and the amount of text, the amount of copy there is, can also affect the design, the actual UI of the page, which is why the design team gets involved, and the dev team also has their inputs for what will work on a desktop, won't necessarily work for a mobile device. So in a nutshell, I kind of went off topic there, but in an agency, that's typically what happens. That's a sprint planning, and that's usually the most you can get out of it. Yes, the developer, him or herself, can use something called a Trello board to keep themselves organized on a daily basis for those, for the 2 weeks that they're working on the project, right? And this is typically from my experience. This is really from my experience, but you'll get more out of Scrum in a product environment, just simply because of the expanded time frames, and just the steady flow that there is. Yes, there are always changes. There are always kickbacks from the client. There are always curveballs that come up, and that's typically always the case. However, it's easier to implement Scrum in a product environment, and that's my take on this. And if you have a different experience, if you have a different take on this, definitely reach out, definitely comment below, and I would love to learn from your experiences as well. And yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic, and I hope you guys find this helpful. And if you have any questions or comments, definitely reach out. And yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.